bias. We've been speaking to the boss of NPR, who's planning a fight back against moves to cut its federal funding. That's all coming up on The Media Show on BBC News.
In nearly 20 years of being a journalist, I think one thing I can say which is true of this region is that it's become much harder to be a journalist.
There's barely any journalism in here holding the government to account.
It's really important to be on the ground, and if that means you've got to go to hostile, remote places, then we have to do that.
That's the opium resin. There's a very pungent smell of it in the air right now.
The Delta wave of COVID devastated India, and I think it was the coverage that we did for the BBC at the time which brought international attention.
What's happening here could affect the world's ability to recover from the pandemic.
When I'm reporting from a region or a country where women's rights are being eroded, what we're most focused on is ensuring that there is a spotlight on that story.
Should women be educated or not?
We've met with families who've had to do the unthinkable.
Another person came up and asked if we'd like to buy their child. The desperation is hard to put in words.
It's really important that we tell the story in a sensitive way and maintain the dignity of the people who are talking to us. Many of the stories we've had to tell are distressing, they're difficult, but that's usually an indicator that they're really important stories to tell.
Live from Singapore, this is BBC News. Donald Trump claims a deal with China has been done. It gets US access to rare minerals from China and eases up on visas for Chinese students.
We made a great deal with China. We're very happy with it.
Lauren Aspen live in Los Angeles, where demonstrations against immigration enforcement raids here in the city are continuing for the sixth straight day.
And in Northern Ireland, a third night of disturbances in Ballymena. Police have asked for help from other forces to deal with the trouble. Welcome to Newsday. Now we start with a developing story. US officials say they have been told Israel is fully ready to launch an operation into Iran. That's according to our US news partner CBS, who spoke to US officials familiar with the situation. This is reportedly part of the reason the US advised some Americans to leave the region earlier on Wednesday. The US partially evacuated its embassy in Iraq, anticipating that Iran could retaliate on the US facilities in Iraq. CBS reports that US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will still meet with Iran for another round of talks on Sunday. And we'll bring you updates on this story as we get them. In the meantime, talks aimed at cooling tensions between the US and China have ended in a trade framework, according to US President Donald Trump. He said China had agreed to supply US companies with magnets and rare earth metals, while the US would walk back its threats to revoke visas of Chinese students. The deal is subject to final approval from both President Xi and President Trump. It follows 2 days of intense talks in London to resolve conflicts that had emerged since the two sides agreed to a truce in May, after a rapid escalation of tariffs had nearly paralyzed trade between the world's two largest economies. Mr. Trump now calls the relationship between both countries excellent.
We made a great deal with China. We're very happy with it. We have everything we need, and we're going to do very well with it, and hopefully they are too. That was a very big one. As you know, we did with the UK, and I tell you what, we're rocking in terms of deals. Now, at a certain point, we're just going to send letters out, and I think you understand that, saying this is the deal. You can take it or you can leave it. You don't have to use it. You don't have to shop. in the United States, as I said.
Let's cross live to Washington and speak with our North America correspondent, Jake Kwan. Jake, President Trump sounding very happy there. Do we know more details about this deal?
The details are actually quite sparse. President Trump says he has a deal with Chinese leader to end the trade war that's been going on. But all we know is that China will begin selling its rare earth mineral as metal and magnets again to the U.S., and the U.S. will continue to welcome Chinese students in America. Now, this deal sounds a lot like the one that they negotiated in Geneva back in early May. Now, that deal broke apart with plenty of finger pointing from both sides. The U.S. accused China of slow walking through their end of the bargain, not selling the rare earth mineral, which is really critical to American industries. And Chinese said that U.S. is not selling its semiconductor chips as agreed. Now, that deal really was derailed for a while. Now, it's really important that the two sides are talking. And I think what the biggest question here is, will this deal stick this time? Now, what gives it optimism is that the two leaders had a phone call before this deal, likely to iron out the differences that had really derailed the last deal in Geneva. So, the optimism is that this deal will likely to stick. But the deal isn't done until there's ink on the paper.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jake, for getting us across that. Jake Kwan, our North America correspondent. Now we can continue the discussion here in studio with me is Steve Okun. He's the Chief Executive of APAC Advisors. Steve, Jake there talking about the deal in Geneva back in May that was very similar to this, but that one fell apart. We heard also President Trump speaking very bullish about how optimistic he is. How optimistic are you about this deal?
No optimism at all. I mean, we are now where we were back a month ago. And that was when the U.S. and China decided to pause the escalation, and then maybe they could decide to meet and try and address the core issues. What we saw happen since then is that there has been an escalation. There's been an escalation by the U.S. by putting more export controls on more sectors that are very important to the Chinese economy. The Chinese retaliate on rare earths and cut off those exports. And what the two sides said, you know what, let's de-escalate what we've done since May. So we're only where we were a month ago. We're nowhere near carving out any real agreement, any real deal on any of the core issues. For Secretary Lutnick to say that we pounded through every key issue between the U.S. and China in 2 days, it's almost laughable to somebody who knows how significant the issues the United States has with China are to say you can resolve all these in 2 days. Is
it different this time around, perhaps because the two leaders spoke in the lead up to this meeting? Jake was saying that was perhaps what sort of greased the wheels towards this recent round of talks.
Well, certainly it does, and it is important to have leader-to-leader discussions to set the tone for the negotiators. So it was very clear that President Trump wanted a pause in the escalation. President Xi wanted a pause in the escalation. So they've just rolled back what has been done. But there's a lot of significant issues to watch, especially in Southeast Asia, what comes out of these talks.
Yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on what we do know. Student visas for rare earths seems like a strange way to go about having a trade deal. That's not usually how they work.
Well, they don't work that way at all, and I don't even know if they work that way in this instance. I've been trying to find the Chinese readout of these talks. They don't mention student visas. You should not be trading, and I don't know that the U.S. traded student visas for rare earths. Look, either the students should be allowed into the United States, or they should not because they're a national security threat. The United States could say we don't want Chinese students because they're a member of the party. They might want to say we don't want these Chinese students because they're criminals. But you don't trade national security for economics. And I don't know that is what happened. I'd be very surprised when anything in writing comes out that that's actually in there. This is just Donald Trump being Donald Trump.
Well, Steve, we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks as always for coming in and speaking to us. Steve Okun, Chief Executive of APAC Advisors. Now, the Pentagon is reviewing a historic defense pact between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom, brokered by the Biden administration, known as AUKUS. It would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines to help combat China's growing influence in the Pacific region. A U.S. defense official says they were doing this review to make sure the initiative is aligned with President Trump's America First initiative. The move could cause alarm for Australia and throw a wrench into the UK's defense planning. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis Defense Priorities. Thanks so much for joining me, Jennifer. What's the main thing we should understand then about the Trump administration wanting to review this AUKUS agreement?
Well, I think the administration is absolutely right to take another look at this deal. It's been controversial since it was signed initially in the United States, primarily because the U.S. submarine industrial base is already stretched. The U.S. cannot meet its own demand for these nuclear-powered submarines. And so there are questions about whether it makes sense to be selling these submarines to Australia and further extending an already overstretched defense production capability. And so I think this is the root of what the Trump administration is looking at right now. The second concern is whether once Australia got these submarines, they would use them in the way the Pentagon is hoping, which is to support U.S. operations in the event of a war over Taiwan. And Australia has not committed to that. So there's the risk that after the United States provides and expends its precious defense production capabilities to an ally, it wouldn't actually get the return it's hoping for. And if that would be the case, then it would make sense to instead focus on producing these submarines first for the United States.
Jennifer, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles has said that it's natural that the administration would want to examine this major undertaking. He also said that the UK government recently concluded an AUKUS review and reaffirmed its support. Do you expect the US to come to the same conclusion?
I think the most likely outcome here is that there might be some tweaks to the timeline. I think one possible approach is that the United States and the Pentagon would decide that under the Trump administration, they were going to focus initially on bridging some of the gaps in the U.S. Submarine capacity, providing additional submarines to the U.S. Navy, and then providing submarines to Australia on a delayed timeline. And so that's one possible outcome here. Another outcome is that the focus of AUKUS would shift to the second pillar, which gets a lot less attention, but is equally important, which is the cooperation between these three allies, the UK, Australia, and the United States on other emerging technologies like hypersonics and quantum. And this is an area where the allies have already been moving ahead. And so the focus of AUKUS might shift away from submarines to this Pillar 2 capacity.
And do you think this plays perhaps into the hands of China, a bigger theme of the US withdrawing from the world, that it benefits China?
Well, rhetorically, I'm sure that if the United States pulled back from AUKUS, China would celebrate. They didn't like the deal from the start. They complained that it was another sign of the Biden administration and the United States building alliances to strategically encircle them. And so rhetorically, I'm sure they would be quite pleased. They might also see it as an opportunity to put pressure on other U.S. allies who might be feeling a little bit more vulnerable if the U.S. were to pull back. But realistically, it's not clear that the pact itself has all that much deterrent value, at least in the near term. Even under the current plan, there was Australia wouldn't get these new submarines until the 2030s. They wouldn't get their own AUKUS-produced nuclear submarines until the 2040s. And if they did get them, China knows just as well as the United States that Australia has not committed to use these submarines in a contingency that would involve China. So if anything, a commitment by the United States to focus its defense industrial capacity on the United States could actually increase deterrence and increase the extent to which China sees the United States as a formidable adversary, because it would augment U.S. military capabilities in a really direct way that the United States would have control over 100%. So I think ultimately the impact on deterrence is still to be determined and might on net be quite small, regardless of what the Pentagon decides.
Jennifer, thanks very much for your thoughts and insight today. Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Now, the White House says immigration enforcement teams have rounded up more than 300 undocumented migrants across Los Angeles, and many of them with criminal backgrounds, as protests against Donald Trump's immigration policies continue. Police say they carried out mass arrests following the introduction of a partial curfew in downtown districts of LA overnight into Wednesday. President Donald Trump has sparked controversy by deploying troops to LA against the wishes of the mayor and California's governor. Now, the U.S. Defense Department says 700 U.S. Marines could be on the streets of LA as soon as Thursday. We can go live now to the streets of LA and connect with Carl Nassman. He's our correspondent there. Carl, get us up to speed with how things have been over the last few hours.
Yeah, Steve, I think one of the big questions was going to be what happened today, because, we saw that curfew going into place last night, ending, of course, this morning. It's set to go back into effect in a couple of hours, around 8 p.m. So the question was, how would demonstrators continue that action today? Well, here you go. This is the answer. This is a big march going through the streets of Los Angeles here. It began at a square a few blocks away. We actually saw two groups of demonstrators converging. This is the result here. I mean, look at the number of people filling the streets right now. They're making their way back to City Hall, Federal Building area. That's where it's happening for the past few days. We should say, though, a peaceful demonstration. We're just going to walk this way. We're going to get out of that way of that car there. We're at the tail end of it here. It stretches all the way in that direction. Peaceful demonstration taking place now. Very limited police presence. But, of course, what will happen when we get closer to that curfew hour, that is still to be decided. And right now, these protests are not going away because the immigration enforcement actions in the city also haven't gone away. You mentioned those numbers. We've seen several different enforcement actions taking place around the area of Los Angeles. I was speaking with a community leader earlier in the day. He told me that the community is scared. This is the largest concentration of undocumented immigrants in the country, and they're just bracing for what might be to come. Talking with some federal officials, Tom Homan, the Trump administration's border czar, says to expect many more days of immigration enforcement to come.
Carl, thanks very much for getting us up to speed with that. Do stay safe out there. Carl Nassman on the streets of LA. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Violence has spread to other parts of Northern Ireland as a third night of disorder continues. The rioting began on Monday after two teenage boys speaking through a Romanian interpreter appeared in court charged with sexual assault. In Ballymena, the smoke bombs, fireworks, bottles and bricks have been thrown at police at a standoff with a gathered crowd. In Larne, a masked young people threw objects at police vehicles, then set fire to a leisure centre. Authorities say the centre had acted as an emergency shelter for families who'd left Ballymena following disorder there. And in Coleraine, transport services were disrupted after a group of young people set fire to bins along local railway tracks. Sarah Gervin reports from Ballymena.
2 nights of intense violence have left homes destroyed, cars on fire, and 32 police officers injured. Police have described the disorder as racist thuggery and say they're treating the attacks as racially motivated hate crimes. This morning, another clean-up, but the events of the past few days have left their mark. Around these streets, residents are beginning to announce their nationalities. Filipino families are putting stickers on their homes, and there are also lots of union flags with signs saying things like, "This is a British household." Now, off camera, people have told us they hope that will be enough to stop their homes being attacked. Meanwhile, others are packing up and leaving. The family who lived here moved to Northern Ireland from Bulgaria a decade ago, but are now moving out, no longer feeling safe after rioters ransacked their home.
It's not possible to wait to see what's going to happen. I have to save my children. 10 years we live in here and work and pay rent normally. Going to school normally, we never make problem.
Others say tension around immigration has been building in this community for some time.
There has been a failure to integrate with a small section of the immigrants. 95%, 99% integrate great, and we go on with them, and it's very regrettable that it's come to this. This is a beautiful wee area to live in years ago, and everybody got along well. This has to stop.
Meanwhile, the Police Service of Northern Ireland has asked for assistance from other forces.
I have now activated the request for mutual aid resources from police and colleagues in Great Britain to ensure we have the necessary support to maintain public order and bring offenders to justice in the days to come.
6 arrests have been made so far, and police say they plan to significantly increase officer numbers moving into this evening and over the next few days. Sarah Gervin, BBC News in Ballymena.
Harvey Weinstein has been found guilty of sexual assault at a retrial in New York. Weinstein's original conviction was overturned last April after an appeals court found he hadn't received a fair trial in 2020. The former film producer was found not guilty of another sexual assault charge, and the jury is yet to return a verdict on a charge of rape. Wednesday's conviction is in addition to a 16-year sentence that Weinstein has yet to serve after being convicted of sexual crimes in Los Angeles. South Korea's military says it has suspended its loudspeaker propaganda broadcasts across the border to North Korea as part of a bid to restore trust between both countries. The move comes a week after the country elected its new president, Lee Jae-myung, who had campaigned on improving inter-Korean ties. Pyongyang considers the loudspeaker propaganda broadcasts an act of war and has threatened to blow them up in the past. Now, Brian Wilson, co-founder of the Beach Boys, one of pop's most successful bands of all time, has died at the age of 82. Capturing the optimism of the 1960s and cultivating a distinctive sound, Wilson is acknowledged as one of the most important songwriters of the 20th century. He wrote and co-wrote more than 24 top 40 hits for the Beach Boys, including God Only Knows and California Girls. Now it's time to turn our focus to business and market news in Business Today. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the U.S. could extend a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs for trading partners who are seen as negotiating in good faith. President Trump echoed that sentiment when speaking to reporters at the Kennedy Center earlier, saying negotiations were ongoing with about 15 countries. BBC's Michelle Fleury has the latest from New York.
With a July 8th deadline looming for dozens of countries to strike tariff agreements with the White House, the Trump administration is hinting that there may be some flexibility. Speaking at a congressional hearing on Wednesday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the US might let the deadline slide for trading partners where talks are going well.
It will be up to President Trump, but it is my belief that if someone is negotiating in good faith, that an extension will be possible.
That's great news.
And in conversations with USTR Ambassador Greer, it's my belief that with smaller countries where we have lower levels of trade, we may be able to do a one-size-fits-all regional deal.
You may recall President Trump imposed sweeping global tariffs on April 2nd, then paused most of them a few days later to allow for what the administration promised would be 90 deals in 90 days. So far, there has been only one agreement with the UK, one extension with the EU, and of course that breakthrough this week with China, which saw Beijing agree to grant US export licenses for rare earth metals, although the Wall Street Journal is reporting that those will only be temporary. In return, the US is making certain concessions, such as allowing Chinese students to attend US colleges and universities. Now, all of this does still need to be rubber-stamped by the two leaders, but essentially it puts relations between these two superpowers back to where they were a month ago. Meanwhile, US stocks closed lower on Wednesday. For Wall Street, the Treasury Secretary's comments are being interpreted as a sign that certainty is still a ways off.
Croissants are known for being buttery baked delights and for being from France. But the boss of a popular Asian bakery has told the BBC they may not be exclusively French anymore, even if customers here in Asia and around the world still associate quality baked goods with France. Our Asia business correspondent, Suranjana Tiwari, caught up with the chairman of the company that owns Paris Baguette to find out more.
If you're craving a fresh, crusty baguette, Paris might come to mind. But believe it or not, this bakery is 100% Korean. What started as a family-owned shop 80 years ago became a key player in mass-producing bread and pastries in South Korea. And now the popular bakery is going global, with 4,000 stores in 14 countries across Asia, Europe and the US. And it has ambitious expansion plans.
Like croissant, could you say this is like a European product? I would say it's a universal product, right?
But going global for Paris Baguette or anyone else in the food business has its challenges. Figuring out local palates and tastes, changing trends in eating, and of course, pricing. The bakery says its system of delivering frozen dough to stores around the world is both efficient and means products have a longer shelf life.
Paris Baguette isn't the only one. Bakeries have become really popular here in Southeast Asia. This is a popular shopping district in the center of Singapore. There are malls all the way down this road, and in their basements there'll be 3, 4, 5 bakeries, all of them Asian. So how do their baked goods match up?
We asked a pastry chef what he thought.
It's quite bad.
It's quite bad?
Yeah, you see, there is no honeycomb. It's totally hollow.
Yeah.
So the lamination was done a little bit better because the internal part collapsed, so that means it doesn't have too much strength.
And here's some local delights. This is a Korean milk cake.
I think it's fantastic, it's very good. The smell of milk is coming over, it's nice, it's fluffy, it's refreshing.
For Paris Baguette, it's counting on a recent sponsorship deal with a British football club to help spread the word.
You just signed a deal with Tottenham Hotspur. What's the vision behind having a football deal like that?
We want to be best in class for bakery industry, and Tottenham is also like Premier League club.
It's very optimistic about the future and taking a little bit of Paris, or rather Asia, to the rest of the world. Suranjana Tiwari, BBC News, Singapore.
US media giants Disney and NBC Universal have filed a joint copyright lawsuit against the artificial intelligence company Midjourney. The suit alleges that its popular image generator had become a, quote, bottomless pit of plagiarism, and that Midjourney repeatedly copied and distributed a host of pictures of some of the most popular characters from Disney and NBC without permission. Bye.
Hello, there are 3 main ingredients in our weather story for the next couple of days. Some warmth, some humidity, and some thunderstorms. Those thunderstorms drifting up from the southwest. Across the southwest of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, we will see some very heavy thundery downpours through the day. Could be enough rain in places to give some localised flooding and travel disruption, with some thunder and lightning and potentially some squally gusty winds as well. A few scattered showers and thunderstorms breaking out across central, eastern and northern parts of England. Much of Scotland will be dry. It's going to feel very warm and very humid. In the sunny spots, highs of 24 or 25 degrees. So outbreaks of rain, perhaps still thundery in places, drifting northwards during Thursday night and on into Friday. Could turn quite murky around some western and southern coasts. Still quite warm and quite humid, 11 to 15 degrees as we start Friday morning. On Friday, we will see some spells of sunshine, some scattered showers and thunderstorms here and there. Some particularly intense thunderstorms just starting to push up from the south as we head towards the end of the afternoon. Temperatures in eastern England could get to 28 or 29 degrees. Some really vicious thunderstorms are possible during Friday night and into Saturday. But as that weather system clears through, it will eventually turn drier and fresher as we head through the weekend. You can check your weekend forecast on the BBC Weather app.
There are not many people in the world who are known just by one name, Arnie. Arnold Schwarzenegger is definitely on that short list. I've come to Austria to talk to the activist and actor, so don't miss it. Arnold Schwarzenegger with me, Laura Kunsberg, in the interview on BBC News.
As some of the UK's biggest retailers are hit by cyber attacks, should a company ever pay a ransom to the hackers? Many do, despite the advice not to. So I'll talk to one of the country's biggest cybersecurity chiefs and a ransom negotiator. Join us this week on Talking Business here on BBC News.
Drone strikes in Ukraine and Russia, prisoner exchanges and occasional rounds of negotiation, but still no sign of a ceasefire. Donald Trump said he could end this conflict, but he hasn't yet. For more on the war in Ukraine, join me, Paul Adams, here on BBC News.
I think the first signs that I wanted to be a journalist were, as a kid, I started making pretend reports. I always liked asking a lot of questions. I've had a lot of different jobs in journalism. What I've learned is that it's always about the people. The wildfires was a story I was living through myself.
It is really hard to comprehend how life is ever going to get back to normal.
Going to bed at night, not really knowing what I was going to wake up to. Fires were burning right around us, so we were having to take split-second decisions about how to gather pictures and tell this story. I knew thousands of people were leaving their homes and were probably never going to get to go back to them. And in the middle of that chaos, I had to find ways to talk to people about what they were experiencing.
That was my house.
It's all gone. I think hearing one person's story helps viewers trust what they're hearing. Because when you can empathise, it helps you get an understanding of the bigger picture.
Now on BBC News, a global, topical, weekly show that lifts the hood on the entertainment and news business, exploring the companies and personalities who command our attention and how our perception of the world is shaped by them. The Media Show.
Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. This week on The Media Show, we'll look at NPR, National Public Radio in the US, and its efforts to resist cuts to its federal funding. We'll learn about the Hajj in Saudi Arabia as a media event, and we'll look at Apple's long history of investing in China. That's all coming up on The Media Show. National Public Radio, NPR, is one of the most recognised names in US media, but President Trump is hostile. He's accused it of having a liberal bias, and he's instigated moves to see its federal funding cut. Well, I've been speaking to NPR's CEO, Catherine Ma, who joined us on The Media Show to discuss the hostility coming from the White House.
Well, my message is really about the importance of public broadcasting and our mandate to serve a wide audience. I think that you'll probably align with this in terms of being a public broadcaster yourself. But one of the things that we see with smaller commercial broadcasters or larger commercial broadcasters is they do tend to specify their audiences around demographics, political beliefs, especially in the United States. As a public broadcaster, we have a mission and mandate as a recipient of taxpayer dollars to serve all points of view and to be able to present the fairest stories possible. So that's what I'm here to speak about. I recognize that my peers in the commercial space also endeavor to do this, but we do have a sort of special aspect with regards to our specific mission.
And I hear your ambition of covering all perspectives and of making sure your content reaches all Americans, but there is a perception you'll be aware of that NPR is much more likely to reach affluent Americans and liberal Americans than it may be to reach people who don't describe themselves in those terms. Is that unfair?
I do think that that perception is unfair, although I recognize that there's also work that we need to do. So looking at the people who come to our website, who listen to our podcasts, and we have the best data because those are the digital platforms that offer us the most insight into our audiences. They really reflect the distribution of the American public from all 50 states. They also reflect the distribution of the American public in terms of their political beliefs. The country is roughly broken up, a third people who lean left, a third people who lean right, and a third people who identify as centrist. And that is the demographic of people who listen to us. So we recognize the perception, and I do believe we have a lot more to do to reach people who are perhaps not as affluent, people who don't live in major cities, and people who perhaps have not finished a college education. But nonetheless, we do have a pretty wide diversity of listeners who come to us for music, news, all of the things that we offer in terms of programming. It would be reductive just to focus on the political aspect of what it is that we report on.
And of course, you know better than anyone that not everyone within the Trump administration, including the president himself, agrees with what you've just said. The president believes that NPR has a liberal bias. He's called for its federal funding and the federal funding of PBS to be withdrawn. And the order connecting to that says neither entity presents a fair, accurate or unbiased portrayal of current events to tax-paying citizens. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the body that distributes this federal money, he says, shall cancel existing direct funding to the maximum extent allowed by law and shall decline to provide future funding. What was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, of course, we were anticipating that the president might take such an action. We were nonetheless disappointed. We feel as though that is counter to the spirit of the Public Broadcasting Act, which is the legislation under which we were created. That act back more than 50 years ago was intended to create a separation between government and public broadcasting in order to be able to maintain our independence. And the president's statements around his perspectives on our editorial production really violate the principles of a free press and free First Amendment rights in the United States. So we have recently entered into litigation around this on the premise that this is a violation of the First Amendment, free association rights, viewpoint discrimination, and a number of other characteristics.
But while you're doing that, the president has now this week moved to formalise this cut, says it could become law within 45 days. So will your legal challenge be considered within that time frame?
Well, that's a good question. We are moving quickly. We have requested that we seek the expedited relief, which is what many organizations who have recently filed suit or enjoined against the administration have also sought to do. It is, of course, up to Congress whether they take up this vote, and we do anticipate that they will in the next 45 days. However, I come back to this point that I made around viewpoint discrimination. We have a robust set of precedent in our judiciary in the United States that says that the government is not in the business of determining what is biased or unbiasing the press. And so we do feel as though from that standpoint, this is really about defending those First Amendment principles from which all of those conversations around funding flow.
Now, you are a relatively new arrival at NPR. Clearly, one of the things on your list of things to do would have been to manage NPR's funding. That's a responsibility of every CEO of the organisation. I just wonder what else was on your list coming in. You must have had a list. What was on it?
Oh my goodness, so much that I was looking forward to doing and still am looking forward to doing. So of course, we're asking ourselves the question of where does generative AI and AI in general fit into the future of news broadcasting? As a broadcaster that grew out of radio, what are we doing in terms of video and our accessibility to younger audiences who are not turning on the radio in the same way that they used to? I was really excited about our opportunity to reach out to those younger audiences and think about how we might create programming that really appeals there. So there are just a number of different things that we're looking forward to doing that perhaps we haven't had the time to do. You know, the backbone in the United States is really this local promise. It's this idea that national programming supports local programming, and local programming is part of why people appreciate national programming. To do that sort of strategic integration would take more time than we've had when we've been so focused on this conversation around federal funding.
All right, so you had a lot of things on your list there. Some of them, for example, how newsrooms use AI is one that we turn to a lot on the media show. Another thing we talk about a lot on the program is the culture of journalism within big organisations. And last week on the programme, we heard from Joe Kahn, the editor of the New York Times, and he told us the craft of journalism is something you can't take for granted when you're hiring people, because increasingly we have to do that training and the building of the values that we consider central to our journalistic mission ourselves, rather than assuming that they got that somewhere else. And I wonder what your ambitions were for the journalistic culture of NPR, and frankly, whether it needed changing.
Well, I think that that is a fantastic question, and certainly one of the conversations that many publishers in the United States have been having. There is a tension and a perception among journalists, particularly younger generations, around what does neutrality or objectivity even look like in this day and age when many of us come from points of view and lived experiences that inform our reporting? And how do we account for that while also seeking to be fair and objective in all of the work that we do? I agree with Khan that the primary thing is really thinking about how do we train on our ethics and integrity as journalists, our processes, our standards and practices. And as NPR, that is a thing that we've been able to do, is to invest heavily in my tenure in that work. And so we've hired additional editors and standards and practice editors. That means the people who give guidance on how we approach stories, difficult conversations, difficult topics that may have ambiguity in the way that they're presented.
But do you think you were coming into a newsroom which was, and it wouldn't be the only newsroom to be accused of this, was being timid or nervous around certain subjects?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question. I wouldn't accuse us of being timid or nervous about coverage, for example, of the administration. I think that that is a thing we've heard a lot recently, is that American newsrooms have had some constraints, perhaps, on how they've approached that, perhaps given their corporate ownership. That has not been an experience for us. My view is that we cover all elected officials fairly and did so before the Trump administration for the Biden administration.
But what about cultural and social issues too? You'll of course be aware of the NPR journalist Yuri Berliner who quit and who accused NPR of having a lack of diversity of thought. Do you think there was any merit to his critique?
I think it is really important for us to have greater diversity in terms of perspectives and viewpoints at NPR and in journalism writ large. I've seen the statistic that fewer than 3% of journalists in the United States identify as conservative. I would recognize that most journalists don't identify politically at all. This is one of the reasons that my view is that that local network of stations and newsrooms is so critically important to public radio and to journalism as a whole, because we really see it as a feeder system for training up young journalists, ensuring that they have high adherence to the integrity we're looking for. But it really brings to us people from across the US who have very different perspectives than what you might anticipate coming out of DC or New York. And so that's of tremendous value to the American public.
And Catherine, when you took over the job, very quickly people highlighted some of the things that you had said about Donald Trump previously. One tweet referred to him as a fascist and a deranged racist sociopath. Do you regret that, or do you think that news organisations need to make their peace with the fact that if they hire people from outside of their organisations, they're going to have had opinions?
I regret that it's become a talking point when we're looking at the work that we do. My view is that my responsibility here, as it has been in every role, is to be able to fully serve our mission. And I measure the success of our work by how well we do that and the perspectives that are reflected both in our programming and in our audiences. And so that is the first and highest goal for me. I do think that it is complicated. We are moving into an era in which every single person who is coming into the workforce has some sort of digital background. I view this as a moment of adaptation in which we are all going to have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis as employers how we handle those backgrounds without them necessarily being disqualifying as we train people in their professional responsibilities.
This is from one of the live streams from Mecca in Saudi Arabia this week, where 2 million Muslims from all over the world have been gathering for the Hajj. It's one of the 5 core duties or pillars of Islam, which all able-bodied Muslims are expected to complete at least once in their lives. The Hajj is also a huge media event. The official Saudi press agency says around 5,000 journalists and tech staff and more than 150 media outlets are accredited. And to get a sense of what it's like to report on, I spoke to Shahab Khan, political correspondent with ITV News. 2 years ago, he took part in the Hajj and also reported on it.
My day job has me as a political correspondent for ITV News, which is obviously very different to being out on the Hajj. I'm usually trapped in Westminster chasing politicians down Whitehall. So this was a very new experience for me in terms of covering a more personal aspect of my life. What we did was we went out and I performed the Hajj. And while I did that, we did two things. We both contributed live reports and live hits to the ITV News for the bulletins at 6:30 and at 10 p.m. And then we also made a long-form documentary, which then went out at the end of my journey, which we then came back and did a very quick, fast turnaround edit. So two very different types of journalism and reporting while we were out there, and a very different experience to the one that I was used to of on-the-day reporting compared to this unique experience of 2 million or so people travelling in from all over the world to all go through a very personal experience.
And apart from making the case to your bosses that this was a story worth covering and a programme worth making, I assume you had to get a range of different permissions from the Saudi authorities to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. This happens every single year. So, as you'll know, when you are trying to have discussions with editors about stories that you think are relevant, we are always looking for a news angle, something that makes it new. So trying to pitch something which is actually an annual event is more difficult than you would think, because when the question comes back at you, well, what's new? This happens every single year. It's quite hard to find. But this was a very unique time because there had just been the pandemic. While the world was in lockdown, the Hajj had to continue because it has gone on continuously for hundreds of years. So during the pandemic, they had a very restricted period where there was only a few hundred or few thousand people. I don't know the exact figures off the top of my head. This time round when I went a couple of years ago, it was the first time they had gone back to full capacity since the pandemic. So that gave us this unique angle and a reason to actually go out there, and it made it very newsworthy and different to what we'd seen before. Also in that time, we had a couple of years of the pandemic obviously disrupting things, and the Saudis used that time to update a lot of technology and make things very different. So we went out there to have a look at what those new technologies would actually look like and how they worked. In terms of the practicalities of actually getting out there, there is, as there often is with any sort of big media event, a long accreditation process. We started it quite early on. It's rare for British journalists to actually go out there because of what I said, because there's not really a new angle every year. So we were dealing with the embassy and going through this process in a way that a lot of journalists in the UK haven't done before, but it was fairly swift. And once we got out there, the challenge was telling this huge story with 2 million people going through this in a way that no one had actually seen before, because we were filming on the ground as we were doing it.
And when you were filming on the ground, were there restrictions on who you could talk to and where you could go?
Yes and no. There were no restrictions because they were put on us by anyone. So we had free rein to do anything. However, there are physical logistical restrictions because there's 2 million people and it's quite hard to move around. And the Saudi security teams who are based there do a lot of crowd management. So we went and had a look at some of the technologies they use. They have cameras, they have drones. They also have experts in crowd management who use these cameras to determine which roads should be closed and when, to try and keep people safe, to stop there being overcrowding. That is actually, when you're filming a documentary or filming a news report, quite tough, because you'll be in position A, you will see position B 100 metres down the road where you want to get to film, but all the roads are shut and it's quite difficult.
Yeah,
so
I can imagine.
That is what was logistically quite challenging.
I was mentioning that, for example, this year we're expecting 5,000 journalists and tech staff to attend. Must they be Muslim to get permission to attend?
Yeah, so to do the Hajj and to be in the area, you have to be a Muslim, which again for us was a bit of a challenge because I wasn't going out there on my own. We had a full team with us. We had a camera crew, we had producers, we had translators. So then we had to find British Muslims or Muslims who had worked for us in different parts of the world to all come together, because to do the Hajj, you do have to be a Muslim. So that was a bit of a challenge. But again, ITV News, and the same with the BBC, of course, we have journalists all over the world and we have colleagues in fantastic places all over the world. So it wasn't too difficult for us to find people who were willing and able to do what is supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
And one final question. When you had completed your reporting, not the live reporting, but when you were collecting material, did anyone need to see it before you sent it back to London to be used?
No, not at all. So the Saudis were very good at just sort of giving us free rein. and letting us do whatever we wanted. No one checked the material afterwards. No one watched the footage. No one watched the reports. No one watched the documentary until they went out on air. We wouldn't have accepted anything otherwise. In the discussions we had before, they didn't even ask, because I think they would have been very aware of the fact that if that was even suggested, we would have said no. And because of that, we went out and gave the most honest and truthful report that we could possibly do. And we tried to highlight all the things that we saw. And I went through my own personal experiences. And if you do watch it, you get to watch me shave my head for the only time in my life, which was quite a brutal experience on camera. And we were honest about it. And you were honest about I was honest about the fact that I was quite nervous about that. And I was honest about the fact that we'd been waiting in a traffic jam for 3.5 hours and we hadn't moved because 2 million people were trying to move from point A to point B. So we were honest, and no one watched any of the footage until it went out on ITV.
Now, as I'm sure you're aware, President Trump has been talking about tariffs a lot in recent months. And one tariff he's floated the idea of is a 25% tariff on smartphone manufacturers, including Apple, if they don't manufacture more in the US. And to understand how Apple does manufacture its smartphones, we've been speaking to Patrick McGee, an FT journalist, an expert on Apple, and someone who has a book out about Apple's investment in China, because to understand how Apple makes smartphones, we've got to look at its connection with Chinese factories.
So I was already the Apple reporter for the Financial Times. So sort of Apple was chosen, let's say, right? That was already the company I was following. The thing that I began to question was what the Achilles heel of the company was. And it's actually because I had become really bullish on the company. You know, our generation is sort of 50-50 Android versus iOS. The next generation, at least in America, is actually about 90% iOS. And so I just began to think, I mean, generationally, as those college kids or high school kids graduate, they're going to be buying MacBooks, they're going to be buying AirPods, etc. And I wrote a number of stories on that front, but I needed to ask the other question too. I didn't want to just be drinking the Kool-Aid. I wanted to ask sort of the Achilles heel question. And everything leads to China if you start asking those questions. And I really thought we just hadn't covered it. The only real story we've covered about Apple in China over the last 20 years is the tedium of assembling an iPhone. And honestly, like, that's about it.
And when did this deep investment in China begin? Has it been going on throughout Apple's existence, or can we pinpoint a moment where it escalated?
No, so if you remember in the 80s, you know, Apple made its own computers, even down to the circuit board. You know, Steve Wozniak was someone that really designed the circuit board and made them, and Steve Jobs' pregnant sister Patty began putting them together while she was on the telephone to people, you know, back in the late 1970s. So Apple then had factories in Ireland, Singapore, and California, later Colorado. And they really built their own computers for a long time. But the problem was that everybody else in the PC industry really began to outsource and then began to offshore. And the result is that Apple was the last holdout. Everyone had either gone bankrupt or gone offshore. And by late 1996, Apple is days away from missing payroll. And so they have to abandon their own manufacturing and adopt outsourcing. Then I tell this sort of 7-year narrative where they're experimenting with contract manufacturers in 8 or 9 countries, you know, places you didn't know that they were building iMacs, the Czech Republic, Wales, even Fullerton, California. Korea was the main place. And China basically wins that battle, let's say, after 7 years. The armies of affordable, abundant labor in China, they don't necessarily have the tech competence, but they respond to Apple's demands, and they'll work 12 hours a day, and it sure is cheap, and they'll build factories at massive scale, at a time scale where, you know, you and I would still be doing the environmental paperwork.
And so this move by Apple to heavily invest in China was something that was actively pursued by the Chinese at huge scale, and they would have seen a big strategic benefit from it happening?
Yeah, I mean, the epigraph to my book is a made in 2015 document from China saying, without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation, right? I mean, China really has this like Nietzschean will to power, and it's based on manufacturing more than anything else. I don't know another country that thinks of manufacturing as the way to, you know, be a part of the world, the way that China does. And so by 2003, Apple really begins to consolidate everything into China. There's no architect to that decision. I don't believe Tim Cook, the current CEO, even though he was the operations guy, was the architect. It was suppliers themselves, dozens, hundreds of suppliers, were all choosing China, because if you looked at you know, how to create a computer on 3 different continents, China was just winning out every time. And so it just sort of consolidated pretty rapidly.
For a while then, that was presumably working very well for Apple and working very well for the Chinese. To what degree, though, has Apple's degree of investment in China left it exposed to a president who comes in and changes the rules of global trade?
So I don't think it's really all that contestable that Apple is stuck in China. I mean, there really is no place on earth that offers the same combination of cost, quantity, and scale. The nuance to my book is that China didn't offer that scale to, or offer that tech competence to Apple. Apple built it there. And so the sort of missing topography in the study of Apple is a part of operations called manufacturing design, or MD. And these are people that would fly from California to literally hundreds of factories across China to handhold, teach, audit, supervise, and install millions of dollars worth of machinery into other people's factories, and later billions of dollars of machinery, to teach them how to use it, to teach them all these skills. And what happens there is China becomes world leading in manufacturing as a result of these staggeringly large investments. I mean, we're talking $55 billion a year in investments in Chinese factories by 2015.
And as I'm listening to you, Patrick, I'm thinking how, in very different ways, Apple is known as being a relatively secretive company, and of course China is known as being a secretive country. So was it difficult to get people to talk?
Yeah, there's nothing relative about it. I mean, Apple is more secretive than the US military, according to people that have worked at both. Very difficult to get people to talk. I did speak with more than 200 people. I would say more than the quantity was actually the caliber of the people, and I think that comes through the text, some of them off record, some of them on record. But it is very difficult to get people to talk. I suppose what worked in my favor is I was telling a 30-year history. So the more that you could inform some source, let's say in 2005, that you already knew so many details that had never been written about 2003, 2004, they would then be willing to sort of tell you a little bit more to sort of help you in the narrative. And then I would just keep doing that until the present.
Well, your book is called Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. We appreciate you coming on to talk about it. There's one other tech story I do want to ask you about before we finish up on the media show today, and it concerns a legend of Apple, Sir Johnny Ive, who designed the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. He has just joined OpenAI, which has bought his startup I.O. in a over $6 billion deal. Let's just hear a little of the clip of the announcement.
The products that we're using to deliver and connect us to unimaginable technology, they're decades old.
Yeah.
And so it's just common sense to at least think, surely there's something beyond these legacy products.
What was your reaction to that, Patrick? Just quickly, if you would.
I would love to be wrong about this, but I'm pretty pessimistic that there's going to be some screenless device coming out of this studio. And the reason I say it is that we're addicted to screens not because they're just compelling. I mean, they work so well for everything. And so are you going to augment the screen and have another cellular connection where there's an expensive device coupled with a monthly price? That seems difficult. Are you going to displace the iPhone altogether? That's a really tall order. So if they can blow my mind with something new, God knows we're all missing a Steve Jobs one more thing moment. And I would love to see that, but I just don't have the imagination for what this is going to do that you couldn't just do on your iPhone.
That was Patrick McGee talking about his book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. And Apple has responded. It says it disputes his investigation and says the book is filled with inaccuracies. That's it for this week. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. As ever, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
And if you'd like to hear a longer version of today's show, search BBC The Media Show, wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, there are three main ingredients in our weather story for the next couple of days. Some warmth, some humidity, and some thunderstorms. Those thunderstorms drifting up from the southwest. Across the southwest of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, we will see some very heavy thundery downpours through the day. Could be enough rain in places to give some localised flooding and travel disruption, with some thunder and lightning and potentially some squally gusty winds as well. A few scattered showers and thunderstorms breaking out across central, eastern and northern parts of England. Much of Scotland will be dry. It's going to feel very warm and very humid. In the sunny spots, highs of 24 or 25 degrees. So outbreaks of rain, perhaps still thundery in places, drifting northwards during Thursday night and on into Friday. Could turn quite murky around some western and southern coasts. Still quite warm and quite humid, 11 to 15 degrees as we start Friday morning. On Friday, we will see some spells of sunshine, some scattered showers and thunderstorms here and there. Some particularly intense thunderstorms just starting to push up from the south as we head towards the end of the afternoon. Temperatures in eastern England could get to 28 or 29 degrees. Some really vicious thunderstorms are possible during Friday night and into Saturday. But as that weather system clears through, it will eventually turn drier and fresher as we head through the weekend. You can check your weekend forecast on the BBC Weather app.
Today we're looking at the state of British politics.
Asking, is technology ruining football?
Are we too obsessed with our phones?
Helen from Hull wants to know, how hot's the planet going to get?
And we'll explain why prices keep going up and up.
Also, Rach, did you know space has its own smell?
Really? What of? The world is fast-moving and can be confusing.
So let's talk about it.
5 Live Breakfast with Rachel and Rick. Listen on BBC Sounds.
I think the first signs that I wanted to be a journalist were when, as a kid, I started making pretend reports in my back garden. I always liked asking a lot of questions. But as I grew up, I wanted to be part of trying to explain why things happen. I've had a lot of different jobs in journalism. What I've learned is that it's always about the people that are at the heart of these stories, how they're affected. The wildfires was a story I was living through myself.
It is really hard to comprehend how life is ever going to get back to normal here.
Overwhelming for so many people in the city, and it was affecting everyone's day-to-day lives. And I was going to bed at night not really knowing what I was going to wake up to the next day. The fires were burning right around us, so we were having to take split-second decisions about how to gather pictures and tell this story.
There's helicopters flying just above us, just dropping water now, trying to keep those flames at bay.
It was tearing through everything. I knew thousands of people were leaving their homes and were probably never going to get to go back to them. And in the middle of that chaos, I had to find ways to talk to people about what they were experiencing.
That was my house.
That's all gone.
I think hearing one person's story helps viewers trust what they're hearing. Because when you can empathise with one person's experience, it helps you get an understanding of the bigger picture.
Live from Singapore, this is BBC News. US officials say they have been told Israel is fully ready to launch an operation into Iran after the US advised Americans to leave the region and partially evacuated its embassy in Iraq. The US launches a review of its multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with the UK and Australia, saying the security pact must fit its America First agenda. Donald Trump claims a deal with China has been done. It gets US access to rare earth minerals from China and eases up on visas for Chinese students. Hundreds of people are arrested in Los Angeles, where protests continue for a 6th day following immigration raids across the city. We start this hour with a developing story. US officials say they have been told Israel is fully ready to launch an operation into Iran. That's according to our US news partner CBS, who spoke to US officials familiar with the situation. Well, we can cross the live now to Washington with our North America correspondent, Jake Kwan. Jake, talk us through what we know so far.
We reported earlier that the U.S. has evacuating its non-essential staff from the Baghdad, as well as the dependents of the diplomats there. It has also advised its citizens to leave the region. What we're learning now is that the U.S. had made that decision because it was told that Israel is fully ready to launch operation into Iran. Now, it is not clear whether an attack is imminent or not, or simply that they are fully ready. It is not very clear what the details or how close we are to an actual attack. But what the U.S. side is saying is that they fear for the life, for the personnel they have in the region, that there is a credible danger to them. And this is coming because they are fearing that the Iran might retaliate to the U.S. sites in the region if they were to be attacked. We also heard from the Iranian defense minister today that if Iran was to be attacked, they would retaliate by striking U.S. military sites. And when President Trump was asked about the earlier report that the U.S. is evacuating its staff from Baghdad, he said simply that it is because it's a dangerous place, and we will need to see what happens. But yes, the details are very sparse, and we'll really need to see what happens.
Yeah, Jake, this is happening while Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is actually going to be meeting with the Iranian foreign minister on the weekend. What should we expect there, given these recent developments?
That's right. Steve Witkoff, the special envoy who has been negotiating with the Iranians, will be still going to the 6th round of talks this Sunday. That is what we understand. And this is all happening after weeks of negotiation with the Iranians. And what we understand is that the White House is growing frustrated by how slow this negotiation is moving. And President Trump has been negotiating not with only Iranians, but with the Israelis as well. There was a phone call with his Israeli counterpart, which lasted about 40 minutes. Now, that call was described as tense, and this call was with Iranians who are growing more and more leaning towards a military solution to the Iranian issue rather than the diplomatic solution that President Trump has been advocating for to keep the nuclear weapons out of the Iranian hands. Now, this is all happening while the White House is really losing its optimism that a deal could be reached. And some of the analysts has been saying that maybe the evacuation could be a way for the White House to signal to the Iranians that the time may be running out to get a diplomatic solution.
And Jake, thanks very much for getting us across those details. Our North America correspondent there, Jake Kwan. Now, the Pentagon is reviewing a historic defense pact between the U.S., Australia, and the United Kingdom, brokered during the Biden administration and known as AUKUS. It would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines to help combat China's growing influence in the Pacific region. A U.S. defense official said the review is to make sure the initiative is aligned with President Trump's America First initiative. The move could cause alarm for Australia and throw a wrench into the UK's defence planning. We can cross live to Sydney now and speak with our Australia correspondent, Katie Watson. Katie, tell us how Australia has been reacting to this news.
Certainly the Australian government is playing down